It's my pleasure to introduce to you Joseph LO BIANCO. Joseph LO BIANCO is Professor of Language and Literacy Education in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. He specializes in language policy studies, bilingualism, and intercultural education, and research and action on peace and conflict in multicultural, multi-ethnic settings. Since 2012, he has directed a multi-country project on language policy and social cohesion in conflict-affected settings in Southeast Asia for UNICEF, and conducted large-scale policy workshops for high-level policy officials across Asia under the auspices of UNESCO. Over the past 6 years, he has been a research consultant on the European Commission project on new multilingualism in 12 European cities. He has an extensive list of publications with a strong research focus on social cohesion, peace, and conflict mitigation in multi-ethnic settings. We have a conflict here, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and so on and so multilingual, and so on and so forth. So with that, I present to you Dr. Joseph LO BIANCO, and the title of his talk is "The Diaspora is on the Move, Unless That Also Has Shifted in Some Way, Shape, or Form." Prego.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And actually it has shifted a little bit because I've got a mysterious addition there, which I'm not going to explain because you can't explain a mystery. And it's ovvero c'è un opossum nella casa. And I'll leave that for you to contemplate. I bet you won't understand what it means. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've got two parts to this talk. Firstly, I'm going to review some developments in diaspora studies as they exist in new sociological directions emanating from both New York and the UK and some parts of Australia, which I think are pertinent to but haven't been applied to the Italian phenomenon yet. And then I'm going to connect this to a new possibility for long-term Italian language revitalization in the diaspora. And I'm going to do this in a way that's a bit tentative because this connection hasn't been properly made. And I'm also going to link this to some new developments on diaspora policy thinking in Australia in relation to Chinese and Indian communities, which I think is a model for what we can or should do. So diaspora studies, or new diaspora studies, is a kind of booming field of research and investigation. But it's links with sociolinguistics, which is the area from which we would generate new ideas about how to keep languages in minority situations alive for longer, has not yet been made or not made very well. So it's a relationship in flux. I've got some more text on these slides than I'm going to be able to talk about, but I'll leave it there while I'm talking, and I hope that you'll be able to extract some of the meaning as I'm proceeding through it. So we are looking at a link between diaspora and language, and we need to keep in mind that the great majority of the thinking about how immigrant languages are kept alive intergenerationally is usually dictated by settled nation-state ideas. You just have to look at the Italian legislation to support the Italian language. Overwhelmingly, until very recently, it was based on the idea of people going to Belgium. You could go by train, you might come back, you could educate your children back home, or partly you could use a curriculum from home. Of course, that never applied very well to Australia, which is so far away. But in the 1972 law was premised on this idea. The citizenship basis of Italian belonging, the jus sanguinis basis of the Italian law, is similar. And so you have this idea that people belong permanently to homelands and the language is attached to that homeland. Now in diaspora situations, you have host lands that host these new arrivals, many of whom, most of whom, will not traditionally go back. But in modern diasporas, the fundamental sense is not of homeland and hostland, but of permanent oscillation between one and the other. So that's essentially, in a really cut-back sense, the way it's going. And it links to some ideas, but these connections haven't been made yet, in sociolinguistics between translanguaging and southern perspectives, which basically comes out of African ways and Indian ways of thinking of languages as not bounded entities that exist in separate space controlled by dictionaries and centres, but that are mixed and flow in the communication world of individuals. Now, this is the reality of immigrant Italians in the United States, in Argentina and other places. But the sociolinguistics of studying this, for example, in Argentina, which looked at all the hybrid forms of Italian Spanish that emerged, never actually located that literature within a context of understanding new diaspora studies. So that's basically an effort to bring these two things together again. So basically, my talk opens up this line of questioning of diaspora language connections without privileging the host country or the home country, just looking at the idea of movement and connection. So Italian Americans relating to Italian Argentinians to Italian Australians, obviously connected somewhere or other to Italy, but not necessarily referring back or through it, and certainly not organised or privileged by home country models of what counts as proficiency, language standards or norms. So this whole new space which is being opened up, and we're developing it. Now, this in Australia has recently come to be thought about as diaspora advantage. Now, it hasn't been thought about in relation to communities like Italians yet, because this arises at a time where Australia and Italy are taking opposite directions. Italy's integrating much more deeply into a Europe, which is integrating rapidly despite the crisis of the last few years, and Australia integrating much more rapidly into Asia. So this apparent distancing at the official level. And this has produced this idea, which has never been applied to Australia, a really amazing report, which I was partly involved in 2016, but was carried forward by a colleague of mine at the University of Melbourne, Professor Fazal Rizvi, on the diaspora advantage. And they claimed 5 features for a diaspora: a claim to a country of family origin, individuals who identify with this claim, individuals who develop emotional attachment to this claim and what it represents to them, these people who are connected despite being dispersed and who can activate links to the homeland and various host lands, and it's mostly around the Chinese and Indian diaspora, the Chinese one being much bigger and longer established, and who are recognised, this is very important, by others for this claim and its links and so on. So the advantage that these people have, and remember, being a minority in a country has always been a point of vulnerability, because actually Section 44 of our Australian Constitution exposes this very dramatically. You are seen to be potentially disloyal. You belong to somewhere else. You've got an attachment to somewhere else. That's what being a diasporic citizen effectively involves. So our Constitution actually bans people like that from standing for Parliament, and we've seen all the catastrophe of the last few years in relation to this. So here we have an officially sponsored government report that's actually opening up, because of the advantage of these minority populations to trade, in a transnational way, this completely new direction for thinking. And I think we have to study this as an Italian-Australian community and see what advantage we can derive, this whole new languaging of our position within society. I think it's true for all communities, but we're talking about Italian Australians here today. So this, what I call strategic placement as insiders, outsiders. Inside this society and outside the Italian one, but also outside all other Italian diasporas in the world, a vast distributed diaspora, and also outside this society and inside both the Italian and the others. So multiple layers of insiderness and outsiderness. And this reorganises the past vulnerability of minorities into an asset, something we've always advocated, but without using diasporic language and understandings to do this. Contacts, some very practical ways you can do this. Some of this report was written by economists who are able to document in a very detailed way concrete material economic advantages in trade, employment. Now, if we could do this kind of thing, I think we could tie this, and this is going to be my conclusions, I'll tell you at the beginning, in Agatha Christie style. She only tells you on the last page. I'm going to tell you who done it right away. Basically, I think we need to stop thinking about language maintenance and start thinking about a strategy for intergenerational vitality of Italian rather than language teaching. Teaching is an essential but inadequate part of the strategy of keeping Italian alive intergenerationally. So these local knowledge, intimacy and context. That is a wider social, historical envelope for the language work we do. Now, someone who's influenced my thinking on this is an American philosopher by the name of Thomas Nail from Denver University. This remarkable book, it's a difficult book, called The Figure of the Migrant. And he looks at, you can see here, he looks at historical figures of migration, the nomad, the barbarian, the vagabond and the proletariat. The great majority of the two great waves of the Italian diaspora fit into the latter category, the proletariat. But the earlier waves of Italian diaspora were the cultural elites who basically established the photographic schools in Japan and Thailand, the staggering, St. Petersburg, the staggering Italian elite cultural expansion post-Renaissance periods. So there's all of this, which he puts together in what he calls kenopolitics, which places mobility at the center of new human identifications. Not place, but mobility. Transience, non-fixity, flow. And this is to replace the old assumptions of stable attachment to a place. Now, this book, I think, is a really significant contribution to new ways of thinking past and present migrants, positioning all of us in relation to migration and flows. The Italian diaspora probably looks like this. Unfortunately, this is bled, as they say, very badly, but you can see the black, the deepest coloured, the peninsula, right, with its islands and its extensions, from which all of this is generated. And you can see the incredible significance of Australia in this. Visually, it's just really apparent. Not only is Australia big, but it's actually isolated as an Italian presence within the overall diaspora. Overwhelmingly, it's a South and North American, a little bit of South African, some of the former Italian colonies in East Africa and North Africa, and other bits and pieces everywhere else. But the Italian elite cultural presence in this diaspora could be another layer of colour you could put on this, which would spread much, much more widely. So we're dealing with multiple layers of coloration all across the globe, which have a connection back to Italy, but horizontal connections with each other. And most scholars of the Italian diaspora effectively identify three, like the emigrants, the classic American departure, New York, and all of that sort of stuff, imagined in Antonio Rocco's 1910 painting of the emigrants in New York, Boston, that part of the United States, then spreading out more broadly, and of course South America. Then we have the second wave, the post-World War II Italian-Australian wave, Port Melbourne, as you can see there. And then we have, documented in Bruno Mascitelli's and Riccardo Armilei's book, The New Wave of Italian Migration, which I was delighted to launch in this very room in October last year, which is much more in line with the thinking of the new diaspora that I've been talking about already. Moving from, and we have many examples of this in Australia, the way in which Italian Americans were regarded as undesirable, immigrants, promiscuous, all of those kinds of things, to a radically different kind of construction of today. So these diasporas are usually distinguished into three, as I've said: the early and huge and vast one, which started really almost immediately after unification in 1861, and only concluded with activities within Italy and the United States at the same time. The imposition by the fascist government in Rome of controls on emigration, but actually partly responding to racist imposition in the United States in new controls of population integration through quotas that were established, which I'll mention very briefly later. And then the post-World War II one, which is ours, and of course the American one coincided with a heavy campaign of Americanization, which was actively promoted, and which is one of the reasons why language loss in the United States of Italian has been much greater than it has been here. But the vast majority, as you'll see later, as Tullio de Mauro calculated, of the immigrants of the 19th and early 20th century were not speakers of standard language, and many of them were not even literate in any kind of Italian form, and so language attrition was extremely rapid in their case, and forced on them anyway. Whereas in Australia, of course, the assimilation has been slower, but not necessarily nice at the beginning. So in fact, the retention has been slightly better. So these three waves involving very vast numbers, as we can see. In fact, it would be regarded, along with the Chinese and Irish diasporas, as numerically the three greatest in the world, and probably significantly greater in ancestry terms numerically than the Irish one. So one of the great diasporas of history, one of the great movements of a population out, but preceded by movement of cultural elites out. So multiple layers. Tullio de Mauro's calculation that only 14% of the Italian population was fluent in standard Italian and literate at unification is a really significant sociolinguistic anchor to speculate about whether language maintenance would be possible. Now we can see that in 2011, well over 4.5 million direct Italian citizens, and of course under the Ius Sanguinis law of Italy, my granddaughter was born my first and only grandchild was born on the 31st of December last year, is automatically an Italian citizen. 17-year-old children born in Rome of immigrant parents don't have a claim on that citizenship. And this, of course, is a major part of the politics of the construction of a new multicultural identity within Italy, which I'm very indirectly involved in, but very interested in, because it's an incredibly important development. So what we see is that the diaspora is constructed both in the home and in the host by actions that produce a middle effect in the way Thomas Nail was imagining. So we should not think of the immigrant population, the diaspora population, as being connected just to the hosts or just to the home. It is clearly an intermediate thing. The Emergency Quota Act of 21, the Immigration Act of 24, and Italian domestic law of the 20s and 30s, which considered immigration, outmigration, a national shame, constructed a new entity of identity different from anything in Italy and anything elsewhere. A recent book on this by two, you must know these individuals, I think, called Italian Mobilities, an entire edited volume, 11 really interesting chapters dedicated to this, shows this in great detail. This is an extraordinary connection between all the kinds of mobility that produce the Italian diaspora. The temporary mobility of tourists and students, the past permanent mobility of emigrants, the current non-permanent mobility of emigrants and immigrants. So all of these they call practices of mobility. And I think you can see here a very interesting application of the ideas of Thomas Nail. So the prized destination of cultural elites, the grand tourists of the past centuries, is linked to the same story because it's all part of Italianità, some kind of connection to Italy, but also across the hosts horizontally. So they call this the largest voluntary emigration recorded world history. And I think that this book is going to make, like some of the others I'm mentioning, a significant contribution to this. Okay, that was just to lay the groundwork of new diaspora studies, and I have just sketched this very complex sociology extremely quickly. I want to now move to language policy and planning and ask, what does this mean for the intergenerational maintenance of a language that now will be a bit more unmoored from the host country? How separated from the host country can we expect Italian to develop? What laws will Italy and programs will Italy develop in the context of this new kind of understanding of languages abroad? And I'm going to draw on some concepts of language policy and planning from Bernard Spolsky, where we look at language policy and planning as not just the official laws of governments, but the language practices of people, an ensemble of activities that make language policy and planning together. So it's not just the law. In the US, they tend to look very much at law because it's a legalistic society, but we need to think of language generation and regeneration as being an activity that's done from the bottom up as well as the top down. And he talks about language practices, the habits and usage of language, the kind of thing we're doing now, and the whole conference, the amount of space and what kind of space we dedicate to Italian and English and other languages. Then language values, beliefs and ideologies about language, and if you attended the papers by Nina Rubino and Steve Sacco yesterday, you would see some really interesting instantiations of this within both America and Australia. ideologies and beliefs about dialect, which has always been a critical part of how Italian language revitalisation has been hampered or favoured, and then language management, which is the actual formal role of policy. So we know the general direction of immigrant languages is towards loss, towards attrition, towards disappearance. There must be, I don't know, I could be corrected, maybe 18 or 28 million Italian Americans. The number of now fourth, fifth generation, very, very few actively maintain Italian for understandable reasons. So what are the ways to reverse or slow this language loss? New diaspora theories suggest a multi-identity translanguaging option. I'm not going to explain all that, but it'll become obvious as I'm talking what they are. I've identified 4 ways that potentially, imagine that we're an Italian-Australian community and we were to act in concert, which we often cannot, of course, because we can't agree about everything, but imagine that we all suddenly became extremely well organised and agreed on everything. How could we act to reverse the loss of Italian? Because although we can be very proud of how much we have achieved in Italian-Australian education here, and I'm going to present some stats on this from the Victorian Education Department of the places in a minute to show this, I think there's still really significant attrition going on. I think when we look at the world, there are at least 4 ways of doing this. We can have language rights, which are formally attributed in law, and it's based around the principle of personality. That is, a Quebecois, a Quebecer, someone living in Quebec, a French speaker, has language rights in wherever part of Canada they go. Not all Francophone Canadians have personality language rights. If you're a Francophone in another part of Canada, you don't have language rights that accompany you in another part of Canada. This is restricted to the people from that area, so they take that. Now that's not available to us in Australia as an option for any language group, so we can't think about that. The other possibility is territory principal language rights, which is what actually Italy enacts really rather well in the Alto Adige, South Tyrol, in some other areas since 1970 in South Tyrol and in Val d'Aosta earlier. But that's not available to Australia either. But this means geographically delimited language rights. So you have language rights, and imagine we said Lygon Street is an Italian-speaking area, and everyone, all language rights in Lygon Street are guaranteed in Italian, but not in German. You would have something like that. This is the cantonal principle. So in Ticino, you have Italian language rights. You go to Zurich, you don't bring your rights with you. I remember working with some schools in Zurich with Italian migrant children who'd come from Naples. They used to have to leave the school at 5 in the evening. They would come back for Italian classes at 7 at night because the school could not be seen to be supporting Italian language maintenance because German is the official language of the canton of Zurich, even though just up the road or down the road you get an Italian language. So that's a completely different principle from the Canadian one. Then you have natural diglossia, which emerges in many different parts of the world, where you have a high and a low form, and this is what the community itself does, that over time, I'm going to go over time, I'm sorry Anthony, I'll have to be a bit faster. But over time, so you get this with Swiss German and High German or Guarani and Spanish in Paraguay, or Lebanese Arabic and Standard Arabic in Lebanon, where you get a high form and a low form, and all the community speaks both. So all the Italian-Australian community would speak English as its high form, ultimately Italian as its low form or dialect, and these would coexist in the life of everybody. This cannot happen to us practically for many different reasons. So none of these possibilities is available to us. So I'm going to have to talk about the 4th one as we go on. They're not available to us for practical reasons and also for some good reasons. We don't have a legalistic culture of language maintenance. We don't have the possible geographic concentration of people that allow us to do it. In Brazil you could do it. There are some cities that have high proportions of Italians, but there's no law that allows it, etc. So none of these possibilities that we see in the rest of the world could work here. There's another reason why something like this is very, very hard, and this comes from the work of Joshua Fishman, with him, I spent a lot of time with him at Yeshiva University in New York, and one of the things that he conceived, I'm not 100% sure this is right, but anyway, he talks about language loss as being a late order form of cultural loss. What he means is, by the time language is lost, when children are no longer using the language, imagine Italian-Australian children no longer using Italian, He says that's actually a late order indicator of an underlying cultural loss that's already happened. So by the time, and you can't see the cultural loss, but you see the language loss. So when the language starts to go, it's because the underlying cultural form that sustains it has already gone. So it's very late in the piece, and you've already lost a lot. So what you're doing is something extremely difficult, because some rival identity outside the home or the ethno-cultural context has replaced the original language, and it can't go back. So this makes reversing language loss very difficult. Look, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but Fishman's ideas about this are set out here. One of the reasons, and the most important one, is that language loss is a late order indicator of something that's already gone. So by the time you see it, it's like the gum tree that falls all of a sudden when yesterday it looked really healthy, and that's because inside it's corroded, but you couldn't see that it was corroded inside. That's a clue to the opossum nella casa. So what is this thing that we have? Well, we've got 1 million people that I call the Italo-Australian Italophone community within Australia. That's a really high proportion of our population. And this is comprised of Italians in Australia, the 2011 generation, what Mascitelli and Damile call the Facebook folk, Italo-Australians and non-Italian Australian Italophones. And there's many aspects of the Italianness and our success in here, which I think is incredibly significant. It's a strong basis on which to build. And what we've basically got is to keep in mind the two modalities of keeping languages strong. I'm going to talk about these as intimacy, that is within the home, and instruction within the school. A healthy language has both. Intimacy, which produces fluency, attachment and identification. Instruction that produces accuracy and high order functioning in the language. So a health for a language, it has both of these things. Now there's been many great people, many of them in this room, who've done wonderful work on language shift, Anglicisation in the first and second generations, language erosion in the second, and attitudes towards these. A wonderful paper presented yesterday by Professor Nina Rubino on exactly this. And all it confirms is this generalised attrition in attitudes, in second generation proficiency, and in Anglicisation. So even the semantic structures of our speech in Italian often are English-based. So this is generic weakening of the language, and we can see statistically significant reduction in Italian claimants in all the censuses. And yet, this is at the level of intimacy within the home. And yet within instruction, we've done something absolutely astonishing. And for American friends, I hope you find this interesting in particular, or anyone else, it won't be just the Americans. But you can see total enrollments. This is, I thank Therese Mercader for supplying these statistics to me, but basically total enrollments in language study, government primary and secondary schools, and the Victorian School of Languages, which is a special language-specific government school that supports more than 50 languages, a great Australian innovation. What we have here, which was actually created in 1936 to support Japanese and Italian teaching, and now supports many more. What you can see is this incredible achievement of Italian in enrolments, and you can see that very clearly in percentage terms, the number one provided supported language, mainly through demand. And this is replicated within the Catholic education system, which educates about 20% or 22% of children. So a really incredible public demand and support for Italian teaching as what I'm going to call the apprenticeship language. Italian coming to be seen as a language of generalised language learning, supporting generalised bilingualism, a good investment in second language acquisition in general, a support for other language specialisations that people might take. Many rich ideas we can develop from these thinking. We can see that in the number of primary and secondary level programs by language, that Italian has actually grown by 9% in that period of time that's being covered here. You can see that in the contrast of the languages, blue Italian, the figure, a recent minor upsurge, but it's held its numbers at a very high level, the 6th most studied language, 2010 to 2016. Chinese Mandarin, Chinese increasing very rapidly and will probably exceed Italian relatively soon, but nevertheless very strong presence for Italian. So there's clearly something beyond our community that involves the diaspora and the relationship of the diaspora to the surrounding host land community. This is something that we need to value. I'm going to show you an image at the end which I think expresses this idea very well. The number of secondary schools, we can see that here we do have a significant problem with Italian because this basic sociology of Italian as a primary school language of socialization, an apprenticeship language, a good language to learn how to learn language with, is not continued into the secondary school, where more specialized connections to employment, something like the diaspora advantage that the Chinese and Indians were developing that I mentioned before, is something we have to do, we have not done. And this is reflected in this statistic. And here you can see the incredible work of the Department of Education, which through its own initiatives from 2012 massively lifted the proportion of primary school language studies. So now, in a way that would put the British to shame, we can practically claim that every single primary school has a language program in the state of Victoria, and a significant number of them, as we have seen, offer Italian, and there are questions of development of these, of course. I'm hurrying a little bit. I just wanted to tell you that the enrolment trends in Italian are brought together in this table, and as you can see, it's distributed across primary schools, the Victorian School of Languages primary offerings, secondary schools where the numbers are depleting, unfortunately, and in the Victorian School of Languages secondary offerings. And the total enrolments at all areas showing, as I said at the beginning, 19% of the total cohort of students in these schools taking Italian. And the total numbers are very, very high. So, a healthy language is informally transmitted at home, in intimacy, as I said, and this is where there is heavy attrition, and it's formally consolidated at school in instruction. Now, this is where we are strong and where we are weak. In homelands, first language intimacy is the shared norm of all citizens, or most citizens, and instruction is the official practice of standard literate language teaching. That's what the Italian state has achieved from 1861 to 1946, although overwhelmingly it was television and radio that made standard language be consolidated rather than schooling. But nevertheless, in most societies you have this interplay between the realm of intimacy, where language is introduced and developed, and the realm of instruction. So to make an endangered language healthy, we need, and here I'm drawing on the principles of François Crin from the University of Geneva, Bianco from the University of Quebec, and my own work developing their original model of COD, capacity, opportunity and desire, where we have basically, I think, concentrated, and the Italian government has pushed us to concentrate because of homeland perceptions, whereas we need to do something very different, and I'm going to develop this. We've concentrated too much on teaching and not enough on opportunity and desire. So capacity refers to increasing young people's linguistic ability or capacity. That is what teaching does. You learn the language, basically. You learn the literacy in the language, you learn the expanded registers you need of the language, etc. Opportunity is the creation of and rewarding of opportunities for the use of the language. And this is where I would say we are deeply weak. This is the weakest point, because basically all the clubs in societies in Melbourne function overwhelmingly in English or in dialect, but not in any systematic way. They don't make any commitment. They're not involved or included in language education development efforts with places like this. There's a great deal to do to include them, just in the way the Catalan language in Catalonia in Spain was developed via a very big I was just there recently looking at that because I'm on a committee of advice to their Ministry of Education. Look, the way in which Catalan has been taken from a highly marginalised home language to now the official language of discourse in education and in many other institutions of state was really through opportunity growth, not through teaching, not through capacity, through creating opportunities where people expected children would use Catalan and not Castilian. They created an expansion of the language, which is something we must do. And then desire. which is to foster the positive desire to use the language. And this is really subtle and actually problematic, and is something where teachers and schools make a contribution, but so too must the community. So we cannot say Italian is an endangered language in Australia in the same way that Pidgin is endangered, but it needs a lot of help to stay healthy. The domain of intimacy is disrupted by English, by outmarriage, and by social pressure. That's not going to change. We are in a host land environment. The domain of instruction is dominated by English, and Italian is represented mainly as a desirable language of second language or foreign language instruction. It's not an extension of community language learning. So COD, capacity, opportunity, and desire, is not just baccalà, okay? Bishestocche baccalà. What basically COD involves, as I've said, from LO BIANCO and my own work, which we applied in a special issue of the Heritage Language Journal, which you can download in 2013. We looked at 8 American languages, Native American languages, Spanish, Japanese, a whole range of languages in the United States. We applied this model to it, and what we found is that basically studying a language is not enough. Studying a language is necessary but not sufficient for intergenerational maintenance. Having language laws like they have in Ireland or other places is not enough either, because the law does not protect the language from eroding. And languages are not like other subjects. You can't treat languages as just being something that schools should be concerned about. They are living things outside of school. If you're interested in that, it's LO BIANCO and Peyton Kreeft, Vitality of Heritage Languages in the United States. So capacity is needed for language learning and maintenance, because the more proficient speakers tend to use the target language more. Those with less proficiency in general do not. We develop proficiency or capacity through intimacy, which produces the fluency, the identification, the attachment, the belonging, which actually in Australia is largely done in dialect, and Nina's wonderful presentation yesterday showed that actually new generations are more confident in believing in this in dialect than in standard, so we have to make a stronger connection between dialect, which actually need to be renamed, they're not dialect, they're other Italian languages, and standard Italian, and formally in education system with teachers and instruction. So intimacy and instruction are sufficient to produce knowledge, but not use of a language. And capacity on its own, is not enough to use to frequent. Okay, yes, I've got my 5 fingers here. Opportunity, this is where we fall down. Opportunities to use a language are critical to the success of the language. We need to be able to do this to arrest the 3-generation pattern of language loss. And opportunities, there's a lot of research literature available from Barcelona-based researchers, but also from many other areas in the world that we can use here, that I think places like COASIT and other agencies involved, we need to work better. All of us need to work better to develop a national strategy for the retention of language use in Australia, not just learning and study. This has to be done together. And then the most subtle and perhaps complex and difficult one of all is desire. How do we convert language ability, which is capacity, and the domains of use into the desire to continue to use it? And this is in the control of the young children, the learners, and they are host land residents. We have to understand their worlds, their subjective positions as they see them, their interculturalism, their bilingualism in relation to the general homeland messages about belonging to this diaspora. This requires us to do significant research, like Angela Scarino and other people in Adelaide have started to do, to understand what the future speaker is going to be, to not have purist attitudes towards them, and to understand that what's being created and preserved is a variety of Italian, and with its own notions of proficiency and use, connected along a continuum with standard language proficiency. I think you know where I'm going with that. So I'm going to finish in a few seconds by summarising this. Capacity, increased vocabulary in registers, which promotes and supports opportunity, but we have to create those expanded contexts for use, where Italian is naturally expected to be used. Then the desire, which is fostered as the intention psychologically within the learner, that then produces the increased motivation. I'm going to finish in a minute and say, I think we've had 3 histories reflecting these 3 diasporas I've been talking about, 3 histories of Italian and Australian education. The foreign, the demotic, and what I'm now going to be calling the projected identity. The foreign was the classic cultural elite presence of Italian. The Grand Tour, the Italo-mania in 19th century Britain, you know, just those of you who are from elsewhere can just travel around Melbourne. You will see Italianate architecture as one of the great styles of 19th century Melbourne wealth. Melbourne was a city that dedicated itself to understanding Italy and connecting with Italy through its British parentage a long, long time ago. This historic cultural citizenship has no direct citizenship effects, but it has a kind of elite cultural effect. Then this is replaced by the demotic or ground-up Italian community migration, hostland citizenship, and homeland nostalgia. I can't develop all these ideas right now. And now we're developing this new idea of Italian as a learnable language, a good choice as a second language for Australian schools, but also a language that we must reinvest with intimacy and with the opportunities of domain and desire. The third history of Italian is one that we need to construct collectively. Technological possibilities allow incredible resources for doing this. I've been doing some research with Tigrinya-speaking children in Melbourne who connect online, on Skype and Zoom every evening after school with children in Bologna, or in Africa, and in Argentina, in naturalized forms, but are not judged by adults as being improficient in their language, and so they're actually developing a lot of identity desire associated with it. We need to mirror these kinds of things. And there is great pressure of divergence. As I've said, Australia's linked more strongly to Asia, Italy's linked more strongly to Europe. There's this divergence, but there's also the new convergence, these new notions of diaspora that I've been talking about, the new sense of diaspora advantage that we must develop, like the Chinese and Indian studies that I was showing you before, and the new possibilities of convergence. There's a great deal to build on. One of them is already present in our society, which is the kind of semiotics of Italian within our wider community. I'm going to finish with this image. Think of it in relation to the opossum nella casa, and I'm going to tell you, even if you're waiting for an Italian tram in Melbourne, you can be given a non-verbal signal of how long your wait is going to be. It's either a ristretto time frame, a macchiato time frame, a cappuccino time frame, or what Australians in Rome call a latte time frame, which involves a lot of sipping, and it means it won't come for 25 minutes. That's the level of penetration of some aspect of Italian semiotics and cultural life within Australia. We need to build a deeper understanding of these cultural messages within a national strategy for language use, not language teaching. Thank you very much.
Bravo.